Hi everyone, my name is AJ Bernard. I'm the pastor at Spring Grove and Center United Methodist Churches in near Washington Courthouse, Ohio. And I want to continue with some stuff in Matthew, I guess, because I've done some Matthean teachings already. But I want to cross-reference it with a passage in Mark and a passage in Daniel, actually. And what I'm going to say is probably controversial. Um, uh, some of you Bible scholars out there will probably hotly disagree with me. I'm used to it. Um, it happens all the time. And that's fine. One of us is allowed to be wrong, whether it's you or me. But I want to show people what the text says, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about why Jesus was killed. Those who advocate for political revolution in the United States or in their own countries like to hop on Jesus' back like a donkey and ride him across the finish line in an attempt to say that Jesus was killed because he was a political revolutionary. And if Jesus is a political revolutionary, doggone it, then let's storm the barricades. So I know I'm already making some people angry, and if that's you, I apologize. You or I, we're allowed to be wrong. But I want to look at what the text actually says. And we're going to start in Mark, chapter 14 and verse 60. Now, Jesus is here before the high priest. He's already been taken from the Garden of Gethsemane. This trial happens in the middle of the night, which is, illegal. He's here before the high priest. He's been taken. This is after Judas' betrayal. This is after a lot of things leading up to the crucifixion. He's going to be crucified in the morning, and they're trying to come up with a charge to crucify him. Now, this is weird, right? Because they're having this trial in the middle of the night, and they're trying to come up with a charge to levy against him. Let's back it up just a minute. In verse 56, it says, "For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree." They had a lot of false witnesses come in, a lot of people come in to lie about him, but their testimony didn't line up. There were details missing. There were things that were wrong. The law of Moses says you can't convict on that, right? You have to have your witnesses agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' Yet even about this their testimony did not agree." So they're struggling. They're searching for a reason to kill him. Why are they searching for a reason to kill him? Because they hate him, because he upsets their apple cart. He's not playing their games. But what is the legal reason that they find to kill him? Because in verses 56, 57, and 58, and 59, I guess they find no agreement in the testimony of the witnesses. So in verse 60, we find this. "And the high priest stood in the midst and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' And he remained silent, but made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?'" Now hold on just a minute there. Verse 61, again the high priest asked him, and this time Jesus chooses to answer. Why does Jesus choose to answer the second time? Well, for that we have to go to Matthew's version of the same story. And in Matthew chapter 26, we find in verse 62, "And the high priest stood up and said, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But Jesus remained silent," right? "And the high priest said to him," so here's the high priest asking the second time. He says, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, the high priest has the authority to demand an answer from Jesus, according to the law of Moses, if he asks in the name of the living God. And so Jesus is legally, under the law of Moses, bound to answer the high priest. And look at what Jesus says. In verse 64 of Matthew 26, he says, "You have said so," that is, you have said correctly. "But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy." What's the blasphemy? Let's look back at what Mark said. Mark says in verse 62, "And Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Now, if you hear my son clapping in the background, I do apologize. It's the it's the apocalypse, and we're all under quarantine, and he's just stir crazy. So please forgive the noise. Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments, which is not legal. The high priest is not allowed to tear his garments. You can see right here in Leviticus 21:10, "The priest who is chief among his brothers, on whose head the anointing oil is poured, and who has been consecrated to wear the garments, shall not let the hair of his head hang loose, nor tear his clothes." So, the high priest is not allowed to rend his garments. But Mark, here, in 14 and 63, says the high priest tore his garments. Matthew, right here in 26 and 65 says the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy." Now, why would someone tear their garments? Because they are overwhelmed at sadness or outrage. It's a way of expressing deep emotion. When someone dies, the father of the person who has died will rend his garments, will tear his clothes. We see David doing this a few times. But the high priest is not allowed to do so, according to Leviticus 21:10. The high priest shall not tear his clothes. Coincidentally, when we're talking about tearing the clothes, we cannot fail to mention that at the death of Christ, the veil of the temple, the curtain that hung between the outer or the inner courts and the Holy of Holies, was torn. And I had been taught my whole life that the reason for that was that God was opening up the Holy of Holies to all of us, that we were all given direct access to God through the death of Christ, his Son. And that is, I think, a good reading of that. But also another good reading of that is that God, who lives in the Holy of Holies, tore his clothes at the death of his Son. So, back to this though. Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming, seated at the right hand of power, and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garment and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy." Now, so what is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. So whatever reason Jesus is killed, whatever legal reason is given for the crucifixion of Christ, is right there in that sentence. Now, most of us, Christians, miss that because we don't understand our Old Testament. But if we go back to Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, we read the following. "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man." What did Jesus say? He says, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Jesus is quoting from Daniel here. And he's claiming to be the Son of Man who comes with the clouds of heaven. But what happens to this Son of Man? What's the point? Why is this blasphemous? Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. That is, he comes before God. And verse 14 says, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away. His kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Baruch Hashem Adonai. So, Jesus is claiming to be the fulfillment of this prophecy in both the Matthean passage. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And also, he's claiming to be the fulfillment of this passage in the Markan passage. I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So, let's dig up one more passage here. Now, one last little rabbit trail before we get back to the crucifixion of Christ. Here in Daniel, we see, to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So if I said his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom shall not be destroyed, if I said all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, who would you think I was talking about? God, right? These are duties that belong, that are owed only to God. You know, all peoples, nations, and languages should serve God, not Messiah. We don't owe this duty to Messiah. We owe this duty to God. And so, what's Jesus doing before the high priest? He is reaching back into the Old Testament. He's pulling out a passage that is weird. Because here, in this passage, God shares his glory with someone else. Behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days. He came to God and was presented before him. And God gives him dominion and glory. God gives him his dominion over all people, nations, and languages. God gives him his glory that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Why is that weird? Because in Isaiah chapter 42 and verse 6, God says, I am the Lord. Now, every time you see that L-O-R-D in all capital letters, you know that it's translating the holy name of God. When God speaks that way, he is speaking, he's giving it a lot of weight, a lot of authority to whatever he's talking about. He's adding his name to the proclamation. Not that he doesn't have weight and authority whenever he speaks without adding his name to it, but the weightiest proclamations God makes, he will add, I am the Lord, or my name is Yehovah, right? Verse 8, he says, I am Yehovah, that is my name. My glory I give to no other. I don't give my glory to anybody else. God may give glory to some, but not his glory, right? God may glorify some like David or Solomon, but he doesn't give his glory to anyone. Or I give my glory to no other except to the Son of Man in Daniel. God gives his glory that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him to this Son of Man. Okay, so when Jesus says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven, what he's doing is he's quoting from Daniel, calling himself the Son of Man, saying that he's coming with the clouds of heaven and that he's seated at the right hand of power. Now, who sits at the king's right hand? The king's son. Why is that? So that the king's son can learn to rule when his father passes. I'm not saying God is going to die. I'm saying that this is the position that Jesus is claiming for himself, that he is seated at the right hand of God. But that also he receives glory from God. He receives God's glory, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Who him? Jesus, him. What's he saying here? He's saying very, very clearly in both Mark and Matthew, I am God. God gives his glory to no other, yet he gives his glory to me. Therefore, I am not other than he. I am not other than God because God gives his glory to me. He is saying, I am God. Now, what does the high priest say in response to this? Because if anybody is going to understand what Jesus is saying, it's the high priest. The high priest who has been educated, the high priest who has studied these texts, these passages his entire life, the high priest who knows this book, the Bible, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, backwards and forwards, left and right, up and down. The high priest who is intimately familiar with all of these passages. How does the high priest interpret this? The high priest says, what further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. Is it blasphemy to claim to be Messiah? No. Nope. Lots of people have done it. There's a group of Jews right now in Israel waiting for the resurrection of Rabbi Schneerson, because they believe that he is the Messiah. He died like 11 years ago or something. It's not blasphemy to claim to be Messiah. It's just wrong, right? What's blasphemy is to claim to be God himself. And this is what the high priest sees. This is what the high priest understands. Not only him, but the entire Sanhedrin. What's your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. Now, they have to go through the Romans. Yes, they have to go through the Romans. Why? Because they don't have the authority. They don't have the legal authority to put a prisoner to death. They're under Roman rule. And so there's a lot of other stuff that goes through there. But this passage right here, this is why Jesus is killed by the Jews. Because he claims to be God in very clear and very unambiguous ways. He claims to be God. So, you non-Trinitarians out there who have who disagree with everything I've just said, please show me where I'm wrong. And everyone else, I really hope this blesses you.